Welcome, everyone. It's Dr. Stephen Linder, and in today's class, we're going to be talking about muscle and muscle physiology and give us a pretty strong understanding as to different types of contraction, talk about the neuromuscular junction, um, talk a little bit about a little bit about muscle atrophy and muscle hypertrophy, a little bit about energy and energy production, um, and we'll make it pretty relevant. Okay, so when we talk about muscles, the primary function of muscle is that we know that it produces body movements, right? When muscles contract, and by that word contraction, what I mean is that muscles generate tension, okay? When muscles contract, they generate tension. I know what there's it's kind of like a misnomer where people think contraction, they automatically go to a muscle as shortening. But if we think of a woman that's going through contractions, right, labor contractions, the woman knows that she feels a lot of tension around the uterus. Okay. So muscles produce movements because they contract. And when I say contract, we know that that term refers to tension. Now, there can be tension that's generated on muscles when a muscle is shortening, when a muscle is lengthening, or if a muscle is remaining the same length. Okay, so a muscle can shorten, a muscle can lengthen, and a muscle can remain the same length. And in all of those, there is tension. Muscles have the ability of stabilizing body positions, meaning many muscles are postural. They contract isometrically and they can maintain certain postures for us, and they stabilize our body. Muscles can also store and mobilize substances within the body. So one of the things that muscles can store, so we have this term called glucose, right? And anything that ends in ose, we know is a sugar, right? Anything that ends in ace, we know is an enzyme. Anything that ends in ogin, like pepsinogen, angiotensinogen, anything that ends in ogen means it's inactive, right? So just a few little tricks. Now, glucose is sugar, and the body uses glucose to help produce energy in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. But, but glucose in high concentrations is pretty toxic to us. It can hurt blood vessels, it can hurt the eyes, it can hurt the kidneys, it can hurt the neurology. So the body doesn't like to have high blood sugar, right? I mean, high blood sugars is diabetes. So the body can store glucose in a form called glycogen. Glycogen. And remember, anything that ends in ogen means it's like it's inactive. So glycogen is stored in muscle. It's stored in muscle, and the other place it's stored is the liver. Okay, so two places that glycogen is stored is muscle and liver. And this is what happens, right? I mean, if you look at marathon runners, right? Marathon runners are very slender. You can see the striations in their leg muscles, in their arm muscles, in their chest muscles. They are tapping in and utilizing their muscles for fuel because that's where glucose is stored. But if that person taps out of glycogen, right, there's no more glucose in the blood. So it taps into muscle. It converts glycogen into glucose. It can convert glycogen into glucose and make useful energy again. But if there's no more glycogen and storage in the muscle, then it taps into the liver. And if it taps into the liver and there's no more left in the liver, that's when the person's at the finish line and you see that marathon runner that looks like they're drunk, right? Where they're all over the place because the brain doesn't have glucose or fuel, so the neurology starts to malfunction. And that's why a lot of runners carry goo with them, right? Goo, it's like taffy, it's all it is glucose. So they have this constant fuel source so that they never get into that, hitting the wall concept where they faint at the end. Okay. And what else do muscles do? Muscles generate heat. Muscles generate heat. We know that if we're exercising, you typically perspire to cool off the body because muscle contractions generate heat. Think of what happens when a person has a fever. They feel cold and then their body starts to shiver and their jaws, they're like this, right? 103, 104 fever. They get under the covers, they're freezing, but their muscles are contracting rapidly to generate heat, which increases body temperature to help destroy viruses and bacterias. Now, in terms of property of muscle tissue, muscles are electrically excitable. We know that if this is a muscle, let's say this is muscle, skeletal muscle, muscles fire or contract because there's an electrical source going to it. Something is plugged into it, and that's the nerve. So this is the nerve, this is the muscle. Where the nerve and muscle meet right there is what we call the neuromuscular junction, the NMJ, the neuromuscular junction. And we know that if we put electrodes on here, right, if you've ever been to a doctor of chiropractic before or a physical therapist, and they put these electrodes on you with these pads, they can turn it on. All of a sudden, it's delivering electricity to muscles, and they start dancing around for you. They start contracting rapidly. Okay, that's called electric stimulation. So muscles are electrically excitable. Muscles have the ability to contract, to generate tension. There is a degree of extensibility and elasticity, right? Extensibility means that after a muscle shortens, it can go back to its resting length. But then after its resting length, it still has the ability to go a little bit more past it because there's a degree of elasticity. If a muscle is stretched past its anatomical limit, then the muscle tears, right? There's no more elasticity. It's surpassed that. Now, in terms of muscle contractions, we're going to talk about three different types of contraction. One is called concentric, the other is called eccentric, and the third type is called isometric. Three main types of contraction. Now, concentric, if we look at this gentleman here in picture A, he's holding the book here in position 1, and then it looks like his biceps over here are contracting and moving the book to position 2. So starting position and finishing position. And the biceps are right here in the front. It originates, I'll put an O here for it originates up near on the supraglenoid. Um, Actually, part of it originates on the supraglenoid tubercle, which is part of the scapula, and another part originates on the coracoid process of the scapula. And now that we've done osteology, you know why we learn these major landmarks. So the origin is up here, and the insertion is on the radial tuberosity, which is on the radius. So you have an origin and the insertion. So in this type of contraction, the origin and the insertion moved closer together. There was tension that was being generated in the biceps brachii, and the tension that was being generated was strong enough to overcome the load or the resistance, which is the book. Okay, so that's called concentric. Think of it as a shortening phase where origin and insertion approximated each other. Notice the origin stays still, and it's the insertion, which is the radius, that's actually doing the moving. The concentric contraction is also called the acceleration phase or the positive contraction, whereas the eccentric is the negative contraction or the deceleration phase. So acceleration is concentric. I'll put an A here for acceleration, and then we'll put a D here for deceleration because in picture B, the starting position is up here, the finishing position is down here at the bottom, and this person is slowly lowering the book at a slower rate of which gravity wants to take it, right? You have gravity working down, and it's not that this is super, super heavy that they can't control it and the arm just drops. They are slowly lowering it. So what's happening is now the origin of the biceps up here, and then down here is the insertion on the radius. So what did the biceps do in relationship to picture A, where the muscle or origin and insertion approximated one another? In eccentric, the origin and the insertion moved further away from one another, whereas the muscle was able to elongate. So think of it as the E in the word eccentric for elongation, right? Elongation of the muscle. Elongation. Okay, and the last type of contraction, isometric, here we have the individual simply holding out the book. Holding out the book, so all of these muscles on the anterior side and all of these muscles on the posterior side are contracting simultaneously. And if you have anterior and posterior muscles contracting, there can't be any movement. It's just held in that neutral position. However, isometric means that there's tension being generated. It's just there's no change in any of the joint angles. The shoulder stays where it is, the elbow stays where it is, the wrist and the finger stay where they are. The term isometric means same meter, same length. There's no change in the joint angle. So concentric is when muscle tension exceeds the resistance and the muscle shortens, meaning the origin and the insertion approximated each other. We call that the positive contraction or the acceleration, whereas eccentric is that peak tension is less than the load and the muscle elongates. Here the O and the I, the origin and the insertion, move further apart from one another, and that's called the negative contraction or the deceleration. In isometric, the tension is never strong enough to exceed the resistance, so there never is a change in the joint angle. Now, you heard me use the word origin and insertion. These are both attachment sites of muscles. One is usually more proximal, whereas the other is usually more distal. Okay, the origin is more proximal, the insertion is usually more distal. And the origin is the part that usually stays still, whereas the insertion is the part that is usually moving. So if we look here, the insertion is moving. That's the forearm. Whereas the origin up here was staying still in both of them. Okay. Now, agonist, synergist, and antagonist. Well, agonist and antagonist, these are opposites to one another, whereas the agonist is the main muscle that provides the movement, and the antagonist is the muscle that opposes it. So if we go back here and I said, okay, what's the agonist for elbow flexion? That would be the biceps brachii. If I said, what's the antagonist? Well, the antagonist would have to be on the opposite side, on the posterior side. So that would be the triceps back here. So the triceps could be an agonist for elbow extension, and then the biceps would be antagonistic to it. Or the biceps is the agonist for elbow flexion, and the triceps are antagonistic to that. So agonists and antagonists are always on opposite sides of the body. A synergist is a helper. So if we're talking about the biceps brachii for elbow flexion, and I said, what's a synergist of that? You would have to pick another elbow flexor, like the biceps brachii or the brachialis. Okay, those are synergists. The term innervation, if we look at the word, we see in and then we see nerve, right? Innervation. So every muscle has a nerve supply. And if there's any obstruction or blockage of the pathway from the brain to the muscle cell, there's going to be atrophy or muscle wasting and weakness. The muscles of the upper extremity, right, everything from the shoulder down to the fingers, that's going to be innervated by nerves that come off the neck called the brachial plexus. And that would be the level from C5 to T1. The muscles of the lower extremity, right, from the hips down to the toes, there are two plexi for that. There's the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus, both in the lower back. The lumbar plexus is from L1 to L4, and the sacral plexus is from L4 to S4. Okay, good place to take our first break. When we come back, we'll talk about muscle histology.